This over here is the Intel ARC A770, and we've reviewed the A750 already, but this one takes the Intel ARC to another level. This right here is the best and fastest GPU Intel has ever produced. And how does it compare to competition at the same price point? Well, not to spoil the conclusion, but there's some more good news. Like some good news from our sponsor.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out WhoKeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out WhoKeys.com in the video description below.
So this particular card that I have here for the Intel ARC A770 is quite a funny name. It's an Acer Predator Bifrost Intel ARC A770. Well, that's a mouthful, but that's what it's called. To put every single label and every single marketing thing onto the title, so there it is. The card is quite an interesting one, and apparently this is one of the best performing A770s, so like high-end A770 in there. This has got two separate types of fans here. First of all, we got one of those normal fans that you have on a GPU that just blows through from here, and then the air comes out from the other side, kind of a blow through on that side. The fan doesn't reach all the way. The PCB goes like maybe a halfway down the fan, as you can see there, and then it blows. The rest of it just comes through. The heatsink is a little bit higher, but it's quite an opening there. And then we've got a blower style fan here as well. So this sucks in the air from this side and then pushes it out from the back here. As you can see, it's got a big opening so the air can come out there. So some of the VRMs get actually cooled down by this blower fan that just blows out from the side. Interesting design, but I personally would have preferred a design that would look like just a blower fan, much bigger and deeper blower fan, just one in the back, and that would have been enough for this card because it's not that particularly power hungry. You've got the Acer Predator logo in there, a nice brushed metal there. This card is actually very, very heavy, even though being just like 2 slots thick, just above 2 slots thick. It's actually heavier than this much bigger card. As you can see, this is bigger in pretty much every single way, but this card feels lighter than this one. This feels very tense and big. Here on the back we see kind of an interesting design of the Acer Predator Intel ARC A770 written in there, made in China. You've got 2 screws on the end here if you want to 3D print some kind of a GPU sag bracket for this. There's 4 heat pipes there. There might be some more hiding inside there. Then we've got 2 8-pin PCIe power connectors, and then there's some LEDs in there. This fan is LED, and then there's the Predator on the side that's LED as well. I personally would have preferred if Intel ARC would have been lit up, not the Predator, and the RGB is kind of iffy here. I'm not particularly a big fan of this design. I would have preferred like this Sparkle A770, which you can get as well, because Sparkle does A770s as well as A750s and the 2 fan size. So check out the different versions of the A770 in the description below, and feel free to pick the cheapest one if you just want to save the money and get the best performance, because they're all perform exactly the same. We're talking about less than 1% difference in the most expensive and cheapest one, just the design difference basically, and cooling's fine for all of them. In terms of the price, where does this one line up? So you can pick up these A770s roughly around 330 to 360 to sometimes even 400, depending like where you're gonna go, but 330 to 350 dollars you can pick one of these up, which is actually pretty much $100 more expensive than the A750, which you'll see makes the A750 even more desirable. But the competition, like the 4060, 3060, go for around $300, maybe slightly less, 310 for the 4060. The 4060 Ti, which this more likely competes with, is around $400+, and then the RTX 3070, which we'll talk about in a moment, is roughly around $400 as well right now on the market. You can get them used for less, but that's right now what you can get for new cards. I'll leave the competition down below as well. So looking at the specs here now, I'm gonna leave the 4060 there and 3060 there because that's really what this card was at first intentioned to compare with. Even though not all of the specs are comparable, like the CUDA, TMUs and Tensor cores aren't called CUDA and Tensor cores in here, just for like easiness sake, I'm gonna put them in there so that you can compare kind of the likes of likes, even though this GPU architecture is completely different. So Intel calls them slightly different, and Nvidia calls them slightly different, and AMD calls them slightly different, and they all work kind of differently, but we can kind of, you know, get core counts and something like that in there. But the A750 and A770 can be compared exactly to each other. So it's exactly the same GPU that we have on the A750, but it's not binned like the A750. So basically this is like the fully saturated or fully, you know, available die, or what the GPU can actually do. It's on the 6nm TSMC process. So interestingly, Intel's not making their own chips here, but still they're 6nm TSMC though, so they're buying the chips in. The CUDA cores have been increased compared to the A750, as well as the TMUs, Tensor cores and RT cores. They're not actually called that, but just so you can compare them, you know, to the Nvidia cores, but they're not the same, just so you know. The memory type is the same as well, but now we have double the amount of VRAM on the A770. Interestingly, there are some 8GB versions of the A770 available as well. Even though I probably won't recommend the 8GB versions, I'd then rather go with the A750 or the 16GB A770 just to get the more VRAM, if that makes sense. Even though the memory bus is exactly the same, 256-bit, the actual bandwidth is higher than the A750 at 560 gigabytes per second, which is much bigger than any of the Nvidia cards at the same price point, by the way. Uses the same interface, and the TDP is interestingly the same as well as on the A750, 225 watts, but I'm seeing roughly around 180 watts drawn, which interestingly is about the same, in fact exactly the same as the A750 as well. So basically they're pulling the same amount of power. Now it can be overclocked, but we're going to talk about that in the end of the video. So before we're going to go into the create the benchmarks, if you want to check out my test bench setup, then check it out in the description below. And if you're interested, check out the merch in the description below as well. There's hoodies as well. Firstly, Geekbench 5, just to see like how much better in very synthetic benchmarks we are compared to the A750. I haven't added any of the Nvidia cards here because I don't actually have the Nvidia cards at hand. And since then, Geekbench have changed it to Geekbench 5 to Geekbench 6. So the Geekbench 6 benchmarks you can see here, the A770 is about 11 to 12.6% faster in the Vulkan and OpenCL scores. But let's have a look at the real world performance in Photoshop. The A770 is slightly faster than the A750 in Adobe Photoshop. You can see 0.6% faster in the overall scores. Just so you know, this is an average of a lot of tests, and within one test they do the same test a few times as well. So it's an average of quite a lot of the tests. Regardless, I'd like to say within a few percent of each card, you're not going to notice a difference, and plus 2-3% is within margin of error, just so you know how to read those benchmarks as well. Even though being faster than the A750, it's quite a bit faster than the RTX 3060 and 4060 and 4060 Ti, to add that into the benchmark as well, even though I don't have the card right now. In Lightroom Classic, it really doesn't matter, and you can get with this card or the A750 or an RTX 3050 or an A380. This really doesn't matter for you over there. Moving on to video editing, and this is where things get more interesting. I highly recommend you check out the A750 review, because there we talked more in depth about like what different benchmarks on Adobe Premiere Pro, and even though the Premiere Pro 24 hasn't been released, which has hardware, I'll explain everything in there, why we test it in there as well. But essentially I'm testing this as well with the Premiere Pro 23.6, which doesn't fully support the hardware acceleration of these media engines inside the A770, but it's still very, very interesting. So looking at the benchmarks compared to the RTX 3060, 4060, the ARC A770 is about 2 to 3.7% faster than the A750. And as you can see, the 3060 and 4060 are quite a bit slower for the same price point. The Nvidia cards are actually slightly cheaper there compared to the A770, just so you know. But looking at the performance increase, it's quite interesting. The GPU effects are about 11% faster than the A750 in standard and extended effects, and that's mostly because of the VRAM, buffer, because this benchmark actually uses about 10 gigabytes of VRAM when running the benchmark. So you can see that the 8 gigabytes kind of is bottleneck, so it has to fill it, perhaps empty it, and then fill it again. But the capacity here has a bit more kind of headroom to just fill, and then there's even more room to go there, which actually for video editors is very, very good, and you'll see is especially good in DaVinci Resolve. But now then, I was interested, how does it compare to the NVIDIA RTX 3070, which I have here? So this is the Founders Edition NVIDIA card, and I pulled it out from the cupboard and wanted to run this benchmark again to see it in Premiere Pro new benchmark there, and I was not expecting the results. The 3070 is quite a bit more expensive than the A770 right now if you want to buy them new. But looking at the benchmarks now, I've kind of shifted these around now. The A770 is the baseline here. The 3060 you can see is about 7 to 7.4% slower in standard and extended overall scores. The RTX 3070 is roughly on par on the extended overall scores, but the standard overall score is about 2.9% slower. The intra-frame extended score is about 15% slower, and the same with the standard is even more, about 18.7 slower, and we can see that the raw score is 3.1% slower. The GPU effects, interestingly, are slightly faster on the 3070, but in overall it performs slightly better than the RTX 3070. And you can see that the A750 is about 2 to 3.5% slower and up to 10% slower in the GPU effects scores. So now, knowing that this A770 is basically the RTX 3070 but just double the amount of VRAM, to me it looks very, very impressive, especially knowing the price point of what these go for right now, even though being last generation cards. And the new generation being out there, the 4070 is even more expensive, so that doesn't make really sense. It's more in the 4060 and 4060 Ti range where it competes in terms of price, which makes it even more impressive because NVIDIA really kind of messed it up. Under the 4070, anything below is really not worth it compared to the previous generation for creators, just because of the memory bus kind of issue in there. Again, please go check out the A750 video, but please check out the previous video about the A750 where I go more in depth about the hardware encoding and how does it work in Premiere Pro and why I'm making this review now. There's a lot of information that I don't go into in this review if you haven't seen the A750 video. Now in After Effects, similarly to the A750, it crashed, and this is not to Intel's fault. What I'd recommend you do is just reference to the Premiere Pro benchmarks, which basically means is a little bit better than the A750, but just this benchmark is always a little bit buggy, so it didn't launch. Now in DaVinci Resolve for video editors, things get very, very interesting. This has been tested with the 18.0.4 version of DaVinci Resolve. If you upgrade to 18.5.1, then you might get even more performance out there because that DaVinci Resolve usually, performs even better. But looking at the A770, the results are about 13 to 14.4, getting close to 15% faster than the A750, which is quite amazing. And now you can see why the bigger capacity on the VRAM is very, very important, and DaVinci Resolve really utilizes this. And you can see how the 4060 is actually kind of handicapped by it because of the memory bus. You can see it's not performing as well, and the 3060 is slightly faster than the RTX 4060. Now when you look at the diffusion scores, the 770 is 22% faster than the A750, which is very interesting indeed. So for video editing, this looks quite interesting. Moving on to 3D, and this is where we kind of have not as good news, I would say. So in V-Ray, this is not supported because V-Ray is based on CUDA and RTX on NVIDIA cards, but in Blender, we can use this ARC, and looking at the results, they are not as impressive as I would have expected. The A770 is about 1 to 2% faster than the A750, which in rendering performance actually doesn't matter at all. They're pretty much the same. What is different there is the VRAM capacity. So if you're working actively in Blender, you have like more space basically to fill it up there and put like all your assets and load them onto the VRAM, which makes it more flexible and kind of matches the VRAM of an RTX 4080, but at the same time the rendering performance of it is not as impressive. Yeah, we're about 20% faster than the 3050, but at the same time we're about 20% slower than the RTX 3060, which is not impressive at all. And in 4060 we're about 80% slower, but the 4060 doesn't actually fill the memory bus on this benchmark. It just uses the actual calculating, you know, how many samples per minute can it render it, and it doesn't really take account the VRAM capacity as much and the memory bus. So in Blender, the news aren't so good either. And the same comes to Octane Bench or Redshift. The 3D performance, we're still waiting for support from Intel to actually build the support for the software, so it's not that impressive there for creators. But now about the overclocking. Now this card can be overclocked. Well, it's not actually overclocked, but the power limit can be pushed a bit higher than what it comes at stock. So at stock it pulls around 180 or something like that, but you can push it up to 253. So even past the Intel's recommended or stock TDP, which is 225. At stock it actually pulls less than the Intel's stock 225 watts, if that makes sense. So I was curious, how much performance is there if we just push those faders to the max and see what happens? And interestingly, nothing happens. The overclocking performance for creators literally gives you zero performance. I don't see any change really and at any of the benchmarks, so there's no point of me showing you 0.1, 0.2% increase because that is within margin of error. So all of the overclocking features for this, they don't really matter. For gaming, perhaps you can get a few more FPS in there, but I'm not bothered about gaming. So for creators, the overclocking doesn't matter, so I'd recommend you just sticking with the stock settings. And when you're looking at the power draw and the temperatures of this card, they're completely fine as well. You don't need to worry about it. It's 2-slot card and it performs very, very well. About 200 watts can easily be cooled with this, and it doesn't go very hot. So then, in conclusion, is this card actually worth it? And I'd say, yeah, I'm very impressed with the A770 for video editors especially. So if you're looking for a budget or mid-range card, then the A770 is a very, very strong contender because it just performs better than the competition at the same price point. Now, yeah, it doesn't have as much 3D support as you'd want, but for video and photo editing, it is very impressive. For photo editing, it's kind of overkill because you don't need that much GPU power. But the 16 gigabytes of VRAM for video editors is absolutely amazing. And those media engines inside for video editing are absolutely amazing as well, which makes this card very impressive in Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve, especially when the Premiere Pro 24 comes out with the full support of the hardware acceleration. You get even more performance out there. In fact, if you buy it right now, I'd recommend using the Premiere Pro beta version with the hardware acceleration there, because this card will perform better there, but because of the benchmark, they don't run in there. But this A770 actually makes some other news even better. The A750 now looks even better because that $100 that you spend extra, you don't necessarily get a lot more performance. You really get the VRAM capacity and a little bit more performance there. But really, it's the VRAM capacity that you're paying for on the A770. And the A750 looks even better now compared to this one, just knowing how well this one performed. For about $100 less, picking up this one is absolutely amazing, and getting a low budget end card that's awesome for video editing. Both of these cards are amazing. So you decide if you want to spend the extra 100 to get the 16 gigabytes of VRAM for perhaps a bit more future proofing with some of your footage and projects, or go with the A750, save a bit more and see what Intel comes out next with the next generation of cards. I'll leave some of the A750 and A770 cards in the description below if you want to check them out. So head down there to pick up your favorite version of it and check out the different links, because one might be cheaper than than the other one, so pick up the cheaper one if you want to save some money. And when you do, why don't spend that extra saved money on some of the merch? Get a nice hoodie for the Christmas season or the winter season. Now, the last tip I would say for creators is that if you are building yourself a creator PC and you don't know which parts to check out, then check out the description below for the latest build guides for the best bang for buck creator PCs. There's a video for you. Pick the one that's closest to your budget and I'll explain everything else there, the upgrades, downgrades. But now, after watching this video, you might know, do you know what? Instead of going with the 3050 or 4060, I'm actually going to pick up the A770 or A750 because it's a much better performance for your workflow. But depends on your workflow. Go check it out down in the description below. Thanks guys for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell on not to miss the future videos, because the 14th gen is just around the corner and you want to know the results. Well, hit the bell on.